We're now going to move on to building out our Explore page. But before we do that, we have one last thing to do within our feed page, and that is to add this area where users are going to see a larger view, a larger component that's going to be embedded in our feed post list that provides them suggestions on other users to follow. So we see this kind of card view as compared to this list view here on the right hand side, and they can tap a forwards or backwards arrow to scroll through all of the users to follow. And this is going to be provided probably after the second post in our feed post list. So within the feed page, we're going to need to find a way in this list here, in our feed post area, we're going to need to find a way to detect what is the third, or rather the second feed post, and then display those suggestions immediately after it. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to, using the array that we're mapping over, within the map function, we're going to grab the index of each of the posts. So we're going to grab the index and we're going to pass it down to the feed post component as another prop called index. So we're going to go within feed post, and if the index prop is equal to 1, so after 0 then 1 for our array, we're going to show this set of cards, this set of follow suggestions. So when index is equal to 1, we're going to set the variable show follow suggestions equal to true. And this variable is going to control the visibility of that component down at the very bottom. So that's going to be underneath article. If show follow suggestions is true, then we want to display the follow suggestions component, which we'll need to import up at the top. And this is going to be, as we mentioned earlier, it's going to be from the shared components folder. So just seeing how this is going to look back within the feed. After the second post, we see the text follow suggestions for that component. So now to build that out, we're going to grab classes, and we're going to start with a div with the class container. And the first thing that we'll have within it is the text suggestions for you. So we'll have a typography component, suggestions for you. The color will be text secondary of this component. The variant will be subtitle 2, and the class typography. Now we're also going to have to fetch this set of data, so we're going to need another, we're going to need to represent that loading state when we're in the process of fetching the users. So I'm going to create another loading variable, and then within this div I'm going to add an inline ternary, or if we're loading, we're going to display a loading large icon, which we'll make sure to import. This is going to be from icons. And if we're not loading, we're going to display a slider component. Now this slider component is not going to come from Material UI, but it's going to come from a third-party package that's going to give us the ability to easily create this slider, this set of cards with this arrow to be able to go to the next set of suggested users. And this is going to be possible through the library React Slick. So to use React Slick, we're going to need to import first the Slick component from React-Slick, but we're also going to need to import some CSS files to provide the styles for this. The first is going to come from, we're going to import Slick Carousel slick/slick.css. We'll just copy this line and also import slick carousel/slick/slick-theme. My mistake, not slider, but slick. And my mistake up at the top, not slick, but slider. So slider will first have a class of slide. It's going to have a prop dot set to false. It's going to be infinite. It's going to have the prop infinite set to true, meaning it's going to cycle through the same results if we keep going through it. Speed is going to be 1000 milliseconds. It's going to take a second to slide from one set of users to another. Touch threshold will be 1002. It'll be variable width. We're going to add the swipe to slide prop. So this is going to make it possible for users on mobile devices to swipe through the list without having those arrows. They can just swipe with their finger. It's going to have arrows on either side, so we'll use the arrows prop. We'll set slides to scroll as 3. So it's going to go to the next set of 3 slides after we hit the arrow or swipe. And the easing, we can set the animation easing. We're going to set that to ease in, out. And slider is going to have an opening, set of opening and closing tags. And for the data itself, we just need to take an array. So we're going to again use array.from. And the length of this is going to be, say, 10. And for this array, we're going to get the default user. So we're going to get more user data, and we're going to map over this. So for each user, we're going to display a new component called the follow suggestions item. So we're going to create that, but for now the key is going to be set to user.id, and it's going to have a user prop set to user. So we'll make follow suggestions item here, right here within this file, and it's going to accept that user prop, destructure it. Up at the top, it's going to use follow suggestion styles, and we're going to grab the following properties, destructure the following properties from user, profile image, username, and name. And we'll begin by returning a div with no class, and then a div in that with the class of card. Then there'll be a link from React Router DOM. So for each of these items, it's going to be these individual cards. And this is going to be to their username. So to /username. Then we'll have an avatar for them. So we'll grab that component. The source will be set to profile_image. The alt text will be username's profile. And for classes, using the classes prop, we're going to set the root class to classes.avatar and the image to classes.avatar.img. And after this first link, we're going to have another link to username once again. So we can copy that, copy the same link. But here we're going to have a typography component with the variant subtitle 2, the class name text, and a line set to center. So underneath the avatar, we have their name, specifically their username to be precise. And then under this link, we're going to have another typography component, the color as text secondary, variant is body2, This will also have the class text and also align center. But here is where we're going to display their name. And then finally, we're going to have our follow button. So we're going to reuse our follow button. So we'll import that. But here we're going to have side set to false. So we're going to have inverted colors, and it's just going to be displayed right underneath all of that text that we have there. So now let's save and see if this shows up properly in our feed page. And right now we just see loading. But if we set loading to false, if we go down past the second element, we see suggestions for you. And we have our slider here, and we can slide to the next set of 3. And it's just going to keep scrolling. It's going to go back to the beginning. We can't see this easily because we're using the same user data, but it's going to go back to the beginning. Now, one thing to improve here is the spacing. We see that underneath each of the feed posts there's some margin. So we want to remove that, or maybe add some additional margin on the bottom of this to even things out. So let's head back to our feed post, and when we're showing our follow suggestions, maybe we also want to change the margin bottom of the article. We want to actually remove some margin bottom. So by default, I believe this value is 60, but when we're showing the follow suggestions for that given post, we maybe only want that value to be 30. So now let's save. And when we go after the second item, yeah, we see that that looks a lot better. So note that once again, this also works on a mobile size. This works perfectly when we're on a mobile device. And additionally, one more thing that we can add is we can make this more button functional. So we can, when we click on the more button here for a given post, we can see a kind of options dialog, what we can do with this post. So let's create that. Our options dialog is listed as a shared component. So here within feed post, let's create a piece of state for it to toggle its visibility. And we're going to call this show options dialog. And the setter will be set options dialog. And when we click on the more button, we'll add an on click and an inline function where in the return we'll set options dialog to true. Now down at the bottom, underneath where we're showing our follow suggestions, let's add another conditional for showing the options dialog. And then we'll import that. Also from our shared folder. And we're going to kind of jump ahead and pass down a callback function, which we're going to call onClose. That's going to enable us to close the options dialog from within the component. So right here, we're just going to pass down a function, an arrow function, that's going to allow us to set options dialog, set that piece of state to false. So here within options dialog, we'll go into that component. First of all, we're going to accept onClose, and we're going to grab classes. And we're going to start with a dialog component. And it's going to have the prop open. And for the classes object, it's going to have the class scrollpaper set to classes.dialog scrollpaper. The onClose function is going to be passed to a prop called onClose. And then its transition component is going to be zoom. So it's going to zoom open and closed. Then within the dialog, we'll have a button. The class will be red button. for this first one, and we'll have the text unfollow. Then underneath that, a divider component. Then can copy the first button to make this a bit easier. I'll have another button, the class of just button, and within it a link from React Router DOM, and this is going to be to the individual post, the post itself, the individual post page, and this is going to be from, we're just going to take the default post, we'll import the default post from the data, from the data file, default post from data, and we're going to just take default post.id. We just need some post ID here for now, and we'll have the text go to post. And we can copy this divider and button. We'll have another divider, and we're going to have a button with just the text share underneath that, then another with the text copy link, then another with the text cancel. And this is where we're going to make it possible to close our dialog by using an onClick and have that set to our onClose callback. So let's see how this works. So let's open our dialog. It opens normally, and when we hit cancel, or if we click away, our dialog closes just like we want. Now let's move on to the Explore page, which really just consists of two parts. The part at the top is really just a larger version of our slider, and beneath is an Explore area where we can explore different posts that different users on the site have made. So these are just kind of aggregated posts from other random users that seem to be popular. So, and we're going to display a kind of preview, and when we hover over this we can see a kind of preview of the number of likes and comments each post gets. So we're just going to create those two parts, and we're going to head over to, we can just close out all of the different components that we've had open, and we're going to go over to the Explore page. Now the structure of this is going to be even simpler than our feed page. We just need to import first Explore suggestions from components, Explore suggestions, as well as Explore grid. So I'm just going to first add Explore suggestions up at the top, and then Explore grid for those other users' posts. From components, explore suggestions. I'll copy this line and modify that for Explore grid. So let's begin with Explore suggestions. Notice that when we make this page smaller, this component goes away and we just see the Explore grid underneath. So first we'll grab classes, and we're going to wrap everything in a hidden component for the breakpoint XS and down. We're going to have a div within that with the class container. Within that, we'll have typography, the color text secondary, variant subtitle 2, component h2, and the class typography. Now we're going to just drop in our follow suggestions component that we just made. That's all we really need to do. So we'll import follow suggestions from the shared folder, But since we're including this header right here with the text discover people, we want to hide the header that's already within follow suggestions. So we want to pass some data down that says we don't want to display this header. And I think the best way to do that is just to provide a prop called hide header, set to true, and we can destructure this within follow suggestions. So if this is true, and by default it's false, if that's true, we'll just wrap this in a conditional, this header in a conditional, and say if we're not hiding the header, if we're not passing that prop through, only then are we going to show the text suggestions for you. But let's see how that turns out. So since we've already created this, it looks almost exactly like the Instagram version, which is great. And then for Explore Grid, this is going to take just a little bit more work because we need to create all of these individual grid posts within this grid, this Explore Grid area. So let's go into Explore Grid, and we'll grab classes. We're going to begin with a fragment here, and our component's just going to first consist of another typography component, because we just have that text up at the top that says Explore, and it'll have the familiar props: color set to text secondary, variant, subtitle 2, component is an H2, we'll add some gutter to the bottom, add some margin to the bottom, and the class here will be typography. We're going to also have some loading state here, so we'll want to bring in the loading large icon, and we'll add a ternary underneath here, so if we're loading, we'll show that icon. Else, we'll want to display our grid of posts. So let's bring in the get default post function from the data file. And here we'll take, actually before we iterate over our posts, we need to add a little bit of structure. We're going to need to add an article, the class article, then a div, the class post container, and then you can take array.from, and the number of posts that we'll have in this grid will be 20. Then we'll get our default post for each of those elements. Then we'll map over each post, and we want to display an individual grid post. So the key of this will be post.id, and we'll pass down all the post data on a post prop. Now we need to import our post grid post component, and that's going to come from our shared folder. We're going to use grid post in a number of places across our app. So this will come from one level up, shared grid post. So as for now, we should see 20 posts in this area. Well, first we see our loading spinner, since loading is true. Once that's false, see 20 items. Now let's head into grid post, and we'll accept the post data. We'll use classes. And we'll start with a div with the class grid post container. Then nested in that, our overlay. So the class will be grid post overlay. Then within grid post overlay, we'll have another div, called with the class of grid posts info. Then finally within that, we're going to have a span, which is going to serve as the holder of our icon. When we hover over an individual post and we see our overlay, we see next to it this like icon. That's what this div is going to be for, and that icon is going to come from our sprite sheet using the class likes. And we're going to use typography to display the count of likes associated with the post, and that's going to come from post.likes. Again, we can destructure the post object, but here I'm not going to. We really just have a couple of pieces of data to use here. Then we can copy grid post info again and paste that in directly underneath. And here we'll use for the span classes.comments. And then within that typography component, we can take comments, post.comments.length to show how many comments it has with its comments icon next to it. And then finally, before the closing div, we'll use an image element where the source is going to come from post.media. So we want to show the media, the image of the given post. Where the text is going to be, the alt text will be post cover image, and then the class of that will be simply image. Now let's look at how that turned out. And again, very close to what the Instagram version looks like. Now when we click on an individual post here in the Explore grid, we see our modal pop up, our post modal. So we see a kind of preview of the post. But as we saw earlier at the very beginning, we're taken to this post route even when we were opening a modal. But when we click away from it, when we click away from the modal, we click on the background or we click on this close icon, we're taken back to the previous page. So how do we make that happen? How do we really go to a new route while still seeing the previous route in the background, and then being able to go back if we need to? Now watch what happens when we click on a post modal, we open that modal, and then we refresh the page. We're taken to the individual post page. So say we were sharing this link with someone else, they would be taken to this page instead of seeing the modal. So naturally we want to make this work, that route change work, and add the ability to see the post in a larger view whenever we click on one of these grid items. So we're going to need to do a little bit of work with our router in order to make that possible. And that's because we really haven't registered or told the router, if we go back to app, we haven't told the router that the post modal component is associated with the post path that we wanted to use, /p/that post ID. We're just declaring or associating the post page as the component. So back in grid post, when we're navigating to our post modal, we want to show our post modal, we're going to need to provide a little bit more information. And we're going to do so by using history. We're going to use the history hook. We're going to get back that history object. And once again, we're going to imperatively go to a different route like we saw, I believe, back within our nav bar. So on our outermost div, we're going to add an onClick, and this is going to call a function which we'll name handle open post modal. So we'll make that function here locally. And this is going to push to a new route. So we'll say history.push. But instead of just providing the path that we want to push to, we're going to provide an object here. So we can provide some additional options. So first of all, we can provide a path name. We can specify the path name that we want to go to. And here the path is /p/ and then the post ID. But additionally, we want to provide some state. We want to provide some information that says we want to show our modal. And this can be custom. There's no real standard protocol for doing this, but for state, what's often passed when using React Router is an object. So on our object, we might want to say modal true. Now, how are we going to use this data in order to display the appropriate component? Well, we're going to make a few changes back within the app component, where we were declaring our router, where we set up our router and our switch statement and all of our routes. We're going to work some magic here so that we can appropriately detect when we want to show our modal and show the post modal component. So first, let's begin by importing our post modal component from the components folder /post/post modal. We want to show this when we detect that we have a route change where the state on the state object modal is set to true. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to move the location of the router. We're going to still have the router wrap our switch statement here, I should say our switch component here, but we're going to put it one level up, and you'll see why in just a second. So we're going to still import browser router from React Router DOM, but we're going to do so within index. So we're going to wrap our router around app. First, we'll import browser router as router from React Router DOM, and we're going to wrap our router around app. We can also include CSS baseline in here. Or actually, we'll move CSS baseline above the router. So app is still nested in the router, but the reason that we're doing this is so that within our app we can use the history data. We're not going to know where we are within our app if we're not within a router. So now, since we've wrapped router around app, we have access to history, and we can use the use history hook to get that appropriate data. So we're going to import use history, one hook, as well as the use location hook. We're going to need to execute both to get appropriately history as well as location data. So let's just quickly console log both of these pieces of data, history and location, up at the top of app to see what they're going to provide. We'll just open our console quickly. So initially, you'll see here up at the top we have a couple of objects. The first one is our history object, and this includes what action is taking place when we go from one route to another. So say if we go to the home route, we're going to see what took place. Well, there was a push action. We push from one route to another. And then for our location data underneath, we have, if we look within this object, we have a state property. So this is where our state object is going to be available. So here's where we're going to get all the information we need to determine which component to show. First of all, the modal data, we're going to create a variable called modal, and the modal data is going to come from location.state.modal. But as we saw, the state object may be undefined, so we want to add a question mark here before the period to make sure that this is undefined before we try to get the modal property off of it. We're also going to use a little trick with a React ref in order to synchronously keep track of the location data. So we're going to put the location within the ref, which we know is just an object, and we're going to call the return value from using ref previous location. So this is just going to allow us to keep track of the previous location that we visited without relying on state, which is asynchronous. Then we're going to take react.useEffect, and we're going to have our effect function run whenever our location changes, as well as if the modal value changes. So whenever our location changes, and if the action of the route change is a push, or anything other than a pop, which means that we go back. If history.action is not equal to pop, if we're not going back, and modal is not equal to true, if not modal, then we want to update the current property of previous location.current with the new location. So location equals previous location.current. And since history.action will also change, we need to pass that to useEffect. Don't worry too much about this if it doesn't make much sense. We're just storing the previous location. We'll see why in a minute. We're also holding on to the modal information being passed from the state object. And we're going to determine if the modal is open. We'll create a variable is modal open. And that's going to be if modal is true and the previous location.current, if the previous location that we're storing is not equal to the current location. So if modal is true and we've moved to a different route, then we're going to say the modal's open. And if the modal's open, we're going to tell switch to use that current location that we've stored. So we're going to use a new prop on switch called location, so where if modal is open, we're going to add a ternary and say we want you to use previous location.current. If the modal's not open, just use the normal location like you've been doing already. In other words, this is just telling switch that we want it to ignore the router's current location and use the previous one if our modal's open. Then finally, note that we haven't included our post modal component just yet, so we're going to add this underneath switch. We're going to need to add a fragment to do so we don't get an error. And if the modal's open, then we want to add a new route, and it's going to be exact, and it's going to be the exact same as this one, with the exact same path as we had for the post page, but the component attached to it is going to be the post modal. So let's save everything and we'll see if this works. We'll go to our Explorer grid and we'll click on an individual post, and we should see, it might be hard to see or impossible to see, we'll click on an individual post and it doesn't look like we see it, although the route changes and we still might be here at the bottom. Yep, we do. We see post modal here at the bottom. We want it to kind of float above all of this content, but we can notice that our route has changed. So now we want to go and actually create the modal itself. It's going to float above all of our content, where if we click on the background, it enables us to go back to the Explore page in this case. So don't be too confused by what we just set up. It's really just a recipe for being able to create a modal like that exists on a separate route. Now we're going to move over to the post page, and we're going to begin with the post modal. So we're going to go to the post folder and components, and then go to post modal. And for our modal, to more easily make it, we're going to be using the package React Modal. So that has an associated component with it. We're going to import that as modal from React Modal. And we're going to begin by grabbing classes, and we're going to return a fragment. And first of all, we're going to have our modal component itself, which will have an opening and closing tag. It's going to have the prop is open set to true. We're going to give it an overlay class name. So to style the overlay, to give it that transparent, translucent black background, we'll give it the class overlay. And then when we want to close the modal, when we click on the background, modal accepts a function on the prop on request close, and it's going to enable us to use history. So again, we're going to call use history, and with history we can just tell it to go back. So we'll add a function here, and in the return we'll just call history.goback to go back to the previous route. And then after this we'll have some inline styles. We need to style specifically the content, and the content within the middle is going to be our post component, which we'll get to in a second, but we really just want to center all of this and make sure it's the right size for now. So for content, we're going to have to write these styles ourselves. It's going to have display set to flex. We'll use flexbox here. Align items will be center. Max width of the content will be 935. The width will be 100%. Top will be 50%. Left 50%. Right will be set to auto. Bottom will be set to auto. Transform will be set to translate. Negative 50%. Negative 50%. Margin 0. Padding 0. Overflow none. And I'm going to set WebKit overflow scrolling to touch. Now within the middle we mentioned that we wanted to include the post component. So we have a post component here, and this is what we're going to use to display our expanded post view both here within the modal and on the individual post page. So we'll import post from /post. And what we're going to need to eventually pass down to it when we have some real data is the ID. We're going to need to pass down the post ID to fetch an individual post data, and that's going to come from the parameters. Remember here we had /p, and then for the router we declared it as the parameter post ID, what we called post ID. Well, a very easy way to get the parameters is with the help of another hook that React Router DOM gives us called useParams. We just need to call this here for our given route, and since we're on our given route in post modal, we can call useParams, and we're going to get back an object, and on that will be a collection of any parameters we might have, but ours is going to be called post ID, so we're going to get back a property of that object with the exact same name as we declared. So post ID is what we're going to need to pass to the post itself. And we can console log this to see that it's what we expect. And lastly, we want to display a close icon here in the top right hand corner. So we have that to import from our icons file, and we'll include it outside of our modal within a separate div. And for this div, we'll give it an onClick where we'll do the same thing. We're just going to call a function where in the return we'll say history.goBack, and the class for this div, just to give it some padding, the class is going to be close. Now we'll save this, and we're not going to see anything for the content within it, but we should at least see, if we refresh, we should at least see still the background of our Explore page, but we have our modal here. And it never exceeds 935 pixels. We have our close button here in the corner, and if we click anywhere on the overlay, we're taken back to the previous route, which is Explore. And then additionally, we're getting a warning just telling us that we want to set the property aria hide app to false, just for the sake of screen readers. And we see in our console the post ID, which matches what we see in the URL. Now, very fortunately for us, since we've done a lot of work with the feed post component, a lot of those elements are mirrored here within the post component that we want to show within our modal and on the individual page. So what we can do in creating that is we can head to feed post, all the way back to feed post, and we can really just copy everything. I believe we can copy everything here, and we can head to the individual post component and just replace it all. Now we're going to need to make a number of changes, a lot of changes, but it's going to be a lot easier than creating this from scratch. The first thing is from styles, we're going to use post styles. We're going to grab all the same icons and components. We're not going to need any props at the moment. We're just going to import them. The function is going to be post, simply post. We're going to import default post from the data file. We're going to use post styles. All of our data is going to come from default post, so we'll destructure default post. We're not going to need show follow suggestions. We're not going to need the caption state. We're not going to need show caption. We can remove the ellipsis here, so we'll get rid of HTML ellipsis. We're going to begin by replacing the fragments that we have around everything with a div with the class of post container. We'll make sure to change the closing tag to a div. We'll remove the inline styles on the article element. This will be our post header. We're going to make the user card here have an avatar size of 32. Then we're going to have our feed post image underneath our header. Rather, our post image instead of feed post image. Then we're going to give that div surrounding the image a class of post image. Then we'll have our post buttons. And for the typography element, this will be likes. I believe I made a mistake for the original feed post. This for the typography element, that should also be likes, if I'm not mistaken. That surrounds the likes count. After this component, we're still going to have a div, but instead of conditionally setting the class, since we're not going to expand or collapse the caption, it's always going to be expanded, I should say. The class is just going to be post caption container. We're not going to have a link here surrounding the next typography element, and that's going to be for the caption. So this will just be a single tag, and the variant will be body2. The class will be post caption, and here we will use dangerously set inner HTML. We'll remove the conditional underneath, that whole ternary underneath. We'll remove the link to view all comments. We're still going to map over the comments, but we're going to move that up into the surrounding div within the post caption container. Then underneath, where we're iterating over all of our comments, we'll still display how long ago that post was made. And we're going to move the hidden component within the typographies div. And then lastly, we'll remove the conditional for showing the follow suggestions component. And then the remaining work that we have to do is for each of our local components, like button, we just need to use post styles, as well as for save button, use post styles, and the same for comment. Now with that, I believe that's everything that we need to do, all the changes that we need to make. And make sure at the very bottom we're exporting post instead of feed post. It's important. And when we go back to Explore and select an individual post, sometimes we need to refresh to make sure that this works correctly. So we'll refresh on the Explore page. And for the post, everything looks good, but we need to put the comment down there at the bottom. And the way to do that is to wrap within the hidden component, wrap divider and comment within a div. And we're going to give it the class of comment. We just need to reorder this to the bottom. Go back and Explore. We select our post. It opens up, perfect. and everything's where it needs to be. And then finishing the post page, when we refresh and see the individual post page, it's very easy as well. So when we refresh here, we just are going to have the post itself up top and then more posts from that user. So we're going to see the post and then more posts from their username, and this is going to be a link to their profile page. So we're just going to see 6 posts there in our familiar grid. So let's head to the post page. And just like Explore, this is going to be very simple. We're going to return layout. We're going to return the layout component. Then we're going to bring in the post component. And once again, we can pass down the ID from parameters. We'll use params. Use params from React Router DOM. I'm kind of doing a couple of things at once here, but we'll use params and get back post ID and pass that down to the ID prop. Then we'll make sure to import layout post, and then underneath we'll have in the post folder and components more posts from user. So we'll grab all 3 of those components. And post is going to be from the same folder, /post. Actually, it's for layout, it's .component/shared/layout, and then for the post component, it's going to be in components, post, and more posts from user, components, post, more posts from user. Then within more posts from user, this too is going to be very straightforward because we can grab everything from a component that we're already familiar with. And that would be the Explore Grid component. So we can copy everything here and go into more posts from user. And I know that we're overwriting a little bit of the work that we've done, or I've done setting this up, but right now we're going to have our function name be more posts from user, and we're going to use more posts from user styles. We're not only going to bring in default posts, let's import actually get default posts and default user, then everything else will stay the same. We want to use more posts from user styles. Then we're going to wrap everything in a div with the class of container, and the bottom will have a closing div tag. For typography, we'll leave all of its props the same, but the text will be more posts from, and then we'll have a little space here. And then after this, we're going to include the user's username, but we're going to include a link from React Router DOM, and it's going to be to their page, their profile page. So we'll use default user.username, and we'll have the class of that be link, and the link text will be at the text at, and then we'll interpolate default user.username. And then I believe everything else stays the same, but we'll make the length of the array just 6 instead of 20 here. Now let's save this and take a look. And once again, we want to export default more posts from user. So good, we see the full view of our post, and we see more posts from the same user with that username.